We're joined by economist Daniel Lacalle, who's, of course, the chief economist at Tariffs. Good morning to you, or rather good afternoon to you over in Madrid, Daniel. I wanted to start with Germany. What do you make of the struggles that the German economy, the largest in the EU, is facing right now?
Well, the challenges of the German economy are very significant. Germany has lost one of its main sources of competitiveness, which was very cheap Russian gas. It has also lost the ability to be a leader in the export to China, but also in receiving goods and services at very competitive prices from the south of Europe. So on top of that, a misguided energy policy and very negative regulatory changes have not helped the German economy. So it is very, very difficult for it to recover fast simply because of a couple of rate cuts. And I think that it requires fundamental structural reforms, particularly ease of business reforms.
So is that how Germany is going to get out of the funk that it presently is in? And how much patience should there be with these reforms?
Well, obviously, structural reforms take time. They're not easy. They don't fix things very quickly. It's not easy to fix an industrial system that was based on cheap energy and pass it to becoming an industrial system based on extremely expensive energy. The decision to shut down the nuclear terminals, very negative decision, and obviously now more dependent on imported natural gas and also of coal. So it is very, very challenging. It'll take time. But obviously, Germany is a country that when it decides to implement structural reforms, as it did in the early 2000s, it can succeed very rapidly and adapt to a challenging environment, unquestionable, in which the relationships with China are not the same anymore, and the relationships with Russia are completely shut down.
Oh, you mentioned a relationship with China. I want to move to China now. Canada, of course, announcing 100% tariffs on electric vehicles coming in from China, I think effective October the 1st. I wanted to get your thoughts on what you make of these tariffs.
Well, it's a big mistake coming from Canada because that is basically a tariff that will be paid by the Canadian citizens. Basically, what the government is doing is putting a 100% tariff on Canadian citizens' imports of electric vehicles. And that is not going to lead to Canadian manufacturers producing more or better electric vehicles. Unfortunately, it will also make those electric vehicles of Canadian manufacturers or US manufacturers more expensive. Because ultimately, the problem in the electric vehicle industry is the access to copper, the access to rare earths, and the technology. Canada needs to invest in commodities, needs to invest in rare earths, needs to invest in mining of copper, and not imposing tariffs which don't solve anything.
Now, China has responded. They're saying it's protectionism. I do want to ask you about Mexico because we're seeing an alignment between the U.S. They've announced the tariffs. Canada has announced tariffs. The EU has announced tariffs. Is Mexico in a tricky spot because there's some Chinese electric vehicle makers who have planned to build factories in Mexico? Is Mexico caught between aligning with the U.S. and also trying to get foreign direct investment from China? How do they balance that act?
Oh, it's very difficult. It's very difficult because we are seeing a very negative and certainly worrying rise in protectionism in developed economies. The European Union, instead of incentivizing technology, mining, and investment, is putting tariffs. The same is happening with Canada, the United States, etc. And that impoverishes the developing economies and hurts the domestic consumers in developed nations. So it's bad for everybody. Protectionism doesn't help anybody. And tariffs are not the solution to alleged elements of lack of competitive equal systems. If the European Union or Canada perceive that China is providing very significant incentives or big subsidies, or that it's not playing with the same level of rules that the rest of manufacturers, it has the ways, or they have the ways of improving the situation without hurting consumers. You mentioned Mexico. Mexico is going to be negatively affected in both sides. On the one hand, in the attraction of foreign direct investment, and on the other hand, in the fact that these tariffs will make those vehicles more expensive for domestic consumers. So ultimately, what ends up happening is that Canadian, North American, European citizens take longer to decide to change their vehicle or purchase a new vehicle. So it's basically just putting yet another burden on manufacturing.
Now, I just want to follow up on that, still on the Mexico situation. What does that mean? I'm not going to get you into who wins what, but the U.S. election is coming up. I mean, Donald Trump, former U.S. president, has said that he plans to impose across-the-board tariffs, I guess to make up for tax cuts that he wants to impose if he wins. And then on the other side, you have the Kamala Harris saying, on a different plane. What does this mean for the geopolitical landscape if, either or, I guess, if Trump wins and gets to impose those tariffs?
Well, both the Democratic Party and the Republicans are going to impose tariffs. There is this sort of message coming across sometimes that tariffs are something that is presented by the Trump administration. Big tariffs were implemented at the beginning with the Obama and Biden administration. Tariffs continued with Trump and will continue if Kamala Harris wins. So I don't think that we can say tariffs are the deciding factor between one and the other. I think that the difference between the Republican candidate and the Democratic candidate is that what we have seen from the historic knowledge is that Donald Trump is a negotiator. At the beginning, it always looks like he is going to impose something very negative and that is going to be very drastic, but always negotiates and negotiated a very, very positive trade deal for Mexico and for the United States as well. In the case of the Democrats, I think that the ticket of Kamala Harris and the ticket of Mr. Walz is significantly different in the sense that it is less about negotiating and it's more about maintaining the status quo. So it's very difficult to see what is going to be the end game. What I think is that in general, the rise of protectionism that started in 2007 with the solar panel tariffs of the Obama administration is likely to continue regardless of who wins.
Thank you for that. Still on tariffs. Tariffs are making headlines everywhere. So Argentina, has announced a reduction in a key import tariff, which, by the way, provided about $4 billion in revenues apparently between December of last year and I think June or July of this year. Looking at Javier Milei, he just came in late last year, December. So what do you make of Argentina's decision, and how do you balance the revenues from that and then the inflationary impact on the other side?
Well, first, the reducing tariffs is not inflationary. Reducing tariffs is deflationary, which is positive for Argentina. It's part of the policy of Mr. Milei. The second thing is that Mr. Milei has said very, very clearly that budget equilibrium is unrenounceable. So he has already reduced the deficit to zero. The budget is in a surplus, so he can afford to take these measures. Furthermore, with the 4 billion of tariffs implemented by the previous Argentine administration, the deficit went through the roof and the peso collapsed.
Gotcha. Now, I want to also talk about clean energy now. The International Energy Agency has a report out saying on energy investments that the world now invests twice as much in clean energy as it does in fossil fuels. There's been this ongoing debate between fossil fuel nations who say they don't want to be forced into, clean energy regimes. They want to move at their own pace. You've got the West that wants to move faster, but they do have a chart that does show over the years that there's more investments in clean energy. So how do you see that dynamic moving forward? Are fossil fuel nations under threat, basically?
I don't think that fossil fuel nations are under threat. I think that the position of fossil fuel producers is very logical. No one can come to a country and say, oh, by the way, you have to get rid of 60% of your wealth just because of a decision in terms of climate that is very misguided, because it doesn't take into account the requirements of mining for copper, for rare earths, all of the things that we mentioned prior. No? So fossil fuel nations have to develop in their own pace. And that is ultimately what an energy transition and a successful energy transition can bring. The only way in which you can bring a successful energy transition is if you prove to the world that it is going to generate more growth, more investment, and better results for the population. If it is imposed, it will condemn 20% of the labor force of the world to impoverishment. That cannot happen, no? So I think that it's logical that nations that have a very significant proportion of their wealth in fossil fuel production continue to manage the situation at their own pace, understanding that they cannot simply just go out because the Europeans or the Canadians want so. They cannot just go out and condemn a very significant proportion of their labor force to impoverishment.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Just one more question for you. Jerome Powell at the Jackson Hole Symposium in Wyoming said the time has come for a monetary policy adjustment. I guess, everyone now is expecting a rate cut, whether it's 25 basis points or 50. I don't know what your thoughts are at the next meeting. What does that mean going forward for the U.S. monetary policy path, and how does that impact the European Union, Bank of England, Bank of Japan, and everyone else?
Well, the first problem is that the battle against inflation has not been finished. Therefore, that is a big challenge, because central banks are going to start cutting rates without hard evidence of a reduction, of a persistent reduction in inflation. Remember that most of the reduction in the inflation rate comes from the base effect. It was very high in July 2023. Therefore, it continues to rise. Inflation continues to go up, but at a lower pace. Therefore, it is very dangerous for central banks to start cutting rates very aggressively. I think that they need to be prudent. They need to also take into account that it's not just that inflation remains elevated and persistent, it's that it remains elevated and persistent with the energy components significantly lower. No? So if they start cutting rates, it will immediately generate a bullish signal to taking leverage on commodities, taking leverage on those activities that will likely generate an inflationary burst in the commodity spectrum. Considering that core inflation remains elevated, those are dangerous elements that they need to take into account very, very seriously. I think that cutting rates in September from the Fed is probably too early, and they need to be very aware of the messages that they have to give, because the market is already discounting 4 more rate cuts into December. And that is very unlikely with the level of inflation that we have right now.
Daniel Lacalle, Chief Economist over at Trust. It's always a pleasure having you discuss these global matters. We thank you so much for your time, sir. Take care.
Thank you very much. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe to my channel, like my videos, leave your comments below, and keep defending freedom. Thank you very much.